Be seated. When I was in the third grade, I succeeded, after a prolonged campaign, in convincing my parents to let me walk the half mile to and from school on my own. It was a beautiful spring day, and I was more than a little bit proud of myself that just as I had assured my parents, nothing had gone wrong at all. I'd managed to get to school just fine, thank you very much. The school day wore on with the usual progression of subjects. There was math, which was followed by reading, which was followed by the universally popular lunch and recess. In the afternoon, we did some rudimentary New York State history, and that was followed by music. We were attempting to play recorders that month. I still feel bad for the music teacher. Finally, the end of the day arrived, and I walked out of school, and I went right to the place where I usually waited for one of my parents to pick me up, stopped there, and waited, and waited, and waited some more, and no one came. The buses left, the crowd thinned, and soon I was standing there by myself. I was terrified, I was angry, I felt abandoned and certain that my parents had forgotten completely about me. Where were they, I wondered? Was something wrong? The questions rushed through my head, and after what felt like an eternity, but I'm sure was only about 30 minutes, my father showed up, asked me if I was all right, and took me home. I don't think I knew what relief really felt like until that moment. Dad had come to the rescue. And it was only after we got home that he reminded me that the only reason that I had waited as long as I did at the school was that I had insisted at great length on walking home by myself. Our Old Testament reading today doesn't really make a whole lot of sense on its own. In order to really understand it, we need to go back a few weeks in the lectionary, back a few chapters in Exodus, back to when the Israelites were crossing through the Red Sea and out of Egypt. They were riding high on their liberation and entering the wilderness with great hope and great expectation. They were following a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But it wasn't long into their time in the wilderness that their feelings of elation at their freedom turned to bitterness and complaint because of their situation. After 3 days without water, they came to Marah, and luckily they found water there. But unfortunately, they couldn't drink it because it was bitter. They complained to Moses, who at God's instruction threw a piece of wood into the water to make it drinkable. Later, they came to the wilderness of Sin, and they found themselves starving for lack of food. Once again, they complained to Moses, and once again, God intervened by sending quail in the evening and miraculous manna in the morning. And so we find ourselves at the beginning of today's reading, where we find our intrepid Israelites shortly after they started receiving their daily rations of quail and manna. But we don't find them, as I would expect them, contented or thankful or assured that God will provide and take care of them because of what they've seen. No, instead of that, we find a group who are scared, thirsty, and worried about where their next drink of water is going to come from. They complain to Moses that they might as well be slaves in Egypt again, and they do that again. Now, there is no doubt that their thirst, which is a kind of thirst that most of us here couldn't even begin to imagine, was real and presented a serious issue for this community making its way through the wilderness outside of Egypt. It's not possible to survive, you're told, much more than a few days without water, even when you have access to daily quail and manna from heaven. And so their situation was serious. And so it makes sense that they would go to Moses. It makes sense that they'd go to the one who had led them out of Egypt and into the desert to address their desperate need for water. What makes less sense, and is rather surprising to me, is their hopelessness and their desire once again to return to their bondage in Egypt, even after all of the mighty works of God had been shown to them, after they had been given water once and food, that still they want to go back to their time in slavery. That they thought that the God who liberated them did so only to let them perish in the wilderness is unfathomable to me. And so it is no wonder at all that Moses felt compelled to throw up his arms in the air and ask God what he should do with these people he has led into the freedom that God had prepared for them. Because they just don't seem to get it. And they're not alone in that. Not getting it, it seems, is one of the less talked about characteristics of those of us who follow our God. The Israelites sojourning through the wilderness of sin don't get it. And they don't get it later when, as the book of Numbers tells it, they are faced with the exact same problem nearly 40 years later at the end of their time in the wilderness. Likewise, Jesus' closest disciples made a habit of not getting it. Poor Peter, first among them, seems to have turned it into an art form. And this pattern is perpetuated throughout Christian history. This pattern eventually prompted Julian of Norwich to write in response that all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. It is that famous medieval phrase, and not water or food or any other physical provision, that lies at the very heart of this passage from Exodus. In providing the Israelites with water and then food, and then with water once again, God is teaching them about who God is, reminding them that they have been brought out of Egypt and have been provided for with love and compassion time and time again, reminding all of us that God is present in our midst, standing right in front of us as on that rock at Horeb, and that we will never be abandoned. That God is faithful to God's people, and that the primary disposition of the God who wonderfully created and more wonderfully redeemed us is one of grace, of care, and of love. That when we cry out in our pain or anger, God will not rebuke us for our propensity to forget God's love for us and our habit of just not getting it, but will instead respond with compassion and an outstretched hand. Standing outside of my elementary school on that spring day, I managed in my panic and in my anxiety to forget an important thing about my parents. They had never once given me any reason to think that they would forget about me or abandon me. Never given me any reason to think that they would do anything other than love and care for me. But in that moment, I joined a long tradition of forgetting the basics in the midst of fear. And so during that car ride home, my father reminded me of what I had forgotten standing outside of that school, and he did so without having to say a single word. It was a small taste of what the Israelites experienced in their relationship with God in the wilderness. A small taste of the grace and love that exists in the midst of fear and anxiety. As forgetful as we are prone to be, it is very good for us to be reminded of these wilderness stories so that they are with us in our own inevitable experiences of the wilderness. So that we are reminded that God is with us as we journey into freedom, present with us in our suffering and our struggling, present whether God's prior acts are remembered or not, whether we are grateful or grumbling, marveling or murmuring, celebrating or crying out, so that we are reminded of the reality that the Lord is indeed among us.